it's time to rest now. Lay your head down. Close your eyes if you like. Let the day fall away behind you. All the noise, the screens, the schedules, all of it can wait. Because tonight we're going back in time, way back. Not just years or decades, but centuries. Over hills and across seas, past kings and castles, past wars and wonders, back to the wild green edge of the world, back to Ireland, and there in the middle of it all was a man with a staff in his hand, a fire in his heart, and a name you've definitely heard before, Saint Patrick. Now, before you start imagining green hats, leprechauns, or giant parades with people dressed as shamrocks, let me stop you right there. That's not quite the Patrick we're talking about. No, the real Patrick didn't have a pot of gold. He didn't drink green beer, and he most certainly didn't chase snakes out of Ireland with a stick like some kind of medieval pest control. What he did do, well, that's the story we're about to tell. But I'll be honest with you. No one knows the full truth. Not really. The story of St. Patrick is a mix of memory and myth, fact and fable, prayer and poetry. Some parts are written down in dusty old scrolls. Other parts are whispered through legend, like stories passed around a fire on a windy night. So, who was St. Patrick really? A holy man? A slave-turned-saint, a rebel preacher, a myth wrapped in robes and mystery? Was he the one who brought Christianity to Ireland, or was he just one of many? Did he really use a shamrock to explain the Holy Trinity? Or did someone make that up over a pint 1,000 years later? We don't know all the answers, but that's okay, because tonight we're not here for hard facts or pop quizzes. We're here for the story. The feel of it, the rhythm of old words and old worlds, the sense of something ancient just on the edge of memory. And maybe, if we listen closely enough, we might catch a whisper from the past. Picture this, it's the 5th century. There are no phones, no cars, no internet, no roads. You'd really want to walk on barefoot, to be honest. Most people live off the land. They grow what they eat, they wear what they can weave, and they believe in a world filled with spirits and gods, trees that talk, stones that remember, and skies that whisper secrets to the sea. Ireland at this time isn't a country the way we know it today. It's a patchwork of kingdoms, clans, and chieftains. The Druids hold power, wise folk, learned in herbs, stars, stories, and the laws of the land. And in the middle of all this, a boy is taken from his home across the water. A boy who doesn't speak the language, who doesn't know the customs, and who is thrown into a life of hardship and silence. That boy's name was Maewyn Succat. Catchy, right? All right, maybe not as catchy as St. Patrick. We'll get to that name change later, but Maewyn is where it all begins. A quiet boy in a strange land, alone, cold, watching sheep under grey skies, praying to a god he barely understood. And somehow, that boy becomes one of the most famous figures in Irish history. But here's the thing, Patrick didn't write much about himself. Just a short confession and a letter or two. More like long journal entries, really. No dramatic autobiography. No How I Converted a Country for Dummies guidebook. So everything else, the miracles, the legends, the snakes, oh yes, we'll get to the snakes, all of that was added over centuries, bit by bit, story by story. Some of it was meant to inspire, some of it was probably meant to impress. And let's be honest, some of it might have been the medieval version of "and then what happened." You know how stories grow when you tell them around a fire. Still, buried beneath the myth, there is a real person, a real journey, a real transformation. A young man taken from his home who comes back years later, not with revenge, but with hope, with a message, with love for the very people who once enslaved him. That's the part that always gets me. It's not just a saint's tale, it's a human one, and tonight we'll follow that path, from the Roman coasts of Britain to the green hills of Ireland, from chains to churches, from a frightened teenager to a figure of legend. We'll walk beside him through dreams and danger, through cold nights and quiet prayers. We'll listen to the stories that made him a saint, and gently peel back the layers to find the man underneath. Because maybe, just maybe, he's not so different from us. So, tuck yourself in, let the wind outside settle, let the night grow quiet, and let the story begin Not with a bang, not with thunder or lightning, but with a whisper from long ago, a whisper that says, there once was a boy who would one day be a saint. Let's go back again, further still, past the green hills of Ireland, across the grey sea, to the edge of the Roman Empire, to a boy named Maewyn Succat. Now, I know what you're thinking. Maewyn? Sounds like someone sneezed while saying Maewyn. Yeah, not quite the saintly name we were expecting, but that's the name he was born with. Sometime around the year 385 AD. That's over 1,600 years ago. Give or take a few birthday candles. Maewyn was born in a part of Britain that was still under Roman rule. Historians think it might have been near modern-day Wales, or maybe somewhere in the west of England. Back then, it was called Roman Britannia, a land of stone villas, Latin-speaking officials, and local tribes learning to live under Roman law. His family wasn't poor. In fact, they were pretty well off. His father, Calpurnius, was a kind of town official, a deacon in the local church, and maybe a tax collector too, which might explain why Maewyn didn't always get invited to birthday parties. His grandfather was even a priest, which tells us the family had a strong connection to early Christianity. But, and here's the twist, young Maewyn didn't seem to care much for religion. At least not yet. By his own account, in a rare piece of writing he left behind, he said he didn't take his faith seriously as a boy. He had other things on his mind, probably like most teenagers today, honestly. Food, friends, not getting caught sneaking out, that sort of thing. He wasn't wild, but he wasn't exactly saint material either. And that's the beautiful part, because saints often start off just like the rest of us. Now let's imagine Maewyn for a moment, a lanky teenager, probably a bit awkward, maybe a little stubborn, living in a Roman-style villa with his family, attending church services because his dad made him, rolling his eyes at long sermons, dreaming of travel or adventure, or just anything more exciting than another day helping with household chores. It was a fairly peaceful life, until it wasn't. One day, sometime around his 16th year, everything changed, and it didn't happen with warning. There were no signs in the sky, no music swelling dramatically in the background, just the sound of shouts and screams and footsteps, rushing towards his home. Irish raiders. They came by sea, sailing swift and silent across the water. This wasn't a random visit. It was a slave raid, a terrifying, brutal attack. These raiders, likely warriors from the Irish coast, were looking for people to capture and bring back as slaves. It was cruel, but it was common in those days, especially between neighbouring islands. And Maewyn was one of the unlucky ones. They grabbed him, dragged him away from his family, and threw him onto a ship. Just like that, his safe, simple life was gone. No goodbyes, no explanations, only wind, waves, and fear. Now imagine you're 16. You barely know how the world works. You've never left your hometown. You don't speak the language of the people who now control your fate. You're tied up, confused, seasick, and scared out of your mind. That was Maewyn. That was the beginning of the boy who would become St. Patrick. The journey across the Irish Sea must have felt endless. Cold, wet, windy. Probably not a lot of snacks on board either. Eventually, the boat landed on the shores of Ireland, a place Maewyn had only heard about in stories. Stories of wild lands, strange gods, and people who painted their faces and danced around fires. It must have felt like another planet. He was taken inland, sold as a slave, and put to work as a shepherd. Just a boy, alone in a new world, watching sheep on the cold, rocky hills of Ireland, day after day, in the rain, in the snow, in the silence. There were no friends to talk to, no warm food waiting for him at home, no church, no school, no protection, just sheep and the wind, and a growing sense of something more. You see, this is where Maewyn began to change. He had no choice but to look inward, to pray, to reach out for something, someone beyond the sheep, the hills, and the pain. And strangely, he found peace in that. In his own writings, he said he began to pray hundreds of times a day while watching the sheep, while walking, even in his sleep. He called God his only hope, his only comfort. Funny, isn't it? How someone who barely cared about religion back home became someone who built his whole life on faith while sitting on a cold hill in the middle of nowhere. Maybe that's how it works sometimes. When everything else is stripped away, we begin to hear the whisper of something deeper. But don't worry. Maewyn's story doesn't end on that hillside. Oh no, not even close. Because that same boy, scared and homesick, wrapped in a ragged cloak, would one day return to this land, not as a slave, but as a missionary. He would walk through the kingdoms of Ireland, speak to kings, light sacred fires, and spread a new message, not with swords, but with stories. But not yet. For now, he was still just Maewyn, just a boy, just a name the world hadn't remembered yet. And as the wind curled round the hills and the sheep munched quietly on grass, he whispered prayers into the sky, not knowing that one day, centuries later, people would whisper his name as a saint. It was just another ordinary day. The sun had risen, the birds had started their usual morning arguments, and Maewyn, the teenage boy who would one day be St. Patrick, had probably just finished breakfast. Maybe he was thinking about skipping chores. Maybe he was trying not to fall asleep during morning prayers. And then they came, out of nowhere. No warning, no time to hide. The Sea Raiders. Now, raiding wasn't exactly uncommon in those days. Ireland, Britain, Scotland, they all had their fair share of back and forth invasions and borrowed cattle, if you catch my drift. But this wasn't about stealing livestock or gold. This raid was for people. Slaves. Maewyn lived in a Romanized part of Britain, possibly near the coast. That meant he was vulnerable, and so were the other villages nearby. On that day, a group of Irish raiders, armed, fast, and fierce, landed near Maewyn's home. They stormed the countryside, took what they wanted, and left before anyone could stop them. And unfortunately for young Maewyn, they wanted him. Imagine it for a second. You're 16. Life is simple, safe, predictable, maybe even a little boring. And suddenly, you're being dragged away from your home by strangers, across the wet sand, onto a strange boat, in a language you don't understand. You don't know where you're going. You don't know if you'll ever see your family again. You don't even know if you'll survive the journey. Let's pause here for a moment, because this is one of those boundless parts of Patrick's story that's easy to brush past. But it's huge. This was trauma, real bone-deep, world-shattering trauma. Everything Maewyn knew, gone. And it didn't happen because of something he did wrong. It just happened, like a storm that comes without warning. And now he's trapped on a ship, probably cold, possibly tied up, and definitely terrified. The trip across the Irish Sea wasn't exactly a cruise. This was no luxury boat, no warm beds or candlelit dinners, just a bunch of stolen boys and girls, tossed together below deck, or maybe even chained on the open deck, while the cold wind slapped their faces and the sea roared all around them. And the boat? Probably a wooden longship, narrow, fast, and not particularly friendly. The raiders might have laughed, sung, or argued as they rowed, but Maewyn? He stayed quiet, scared, alone, and seasick probably. Let's be real, this is not the time to discover you get motion sickness. Eventually, the ship reached the coast of Ireland, and to Maewyn, it must have felt like landing on the moon. Strange trees, strange smells, strange voices shouting strange words. He was marched inland, maybe across bogs and hills, maybe through forests and fields, until he arrived at a place that would become his new home. Not by choice. He was sold like an object, like a shovel or sheep. And just like that, Maewyn the Roman boy became Maewyn the Irish slave. He was sent to work for a local chieftain. Some sources say his master's name was Miliuk, a man from the north, possibly in County Antrim. His job? Shepherd. Just like that, the boy who used to live in a villa with tiled floors and warm bread was now sleeping outside, watching sheep, in the cold, in the rain, in a land that didn't speak his language, and didn't particularly care if he lived or died. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Shepherding doesn't sound that bad. Let me stop you there. This wasn't some soft, Instagrammable shepherd's life with fluffy lambs and scenic views. This was brutal. Days alone on rocky hillsides, nights in the freezing dark with nothing but a thin cloak and a few stubborn sheep for company. Wolves, rain, hunger, loneliness. 16 years old and completely cut off from the world he knew. But here's the strange thing. Here's where it gets interesting. Something began to change. As Maewyn sat alone with the sheep, For hours, days, months, he began to turn inward. He had nothing else to do. No books, no conversations, no distractions. So he started to pray. And at first, it was probably just out of fear. He wanted safety, food, a way out. But over time, the prayers became something else. A habit, a rhythm, a comfort. Later, when he wrote about this time in his life, he said he would pray up to 100 times a day. Sometimes more. In the cold, in the snow, in the dark. He said he never felt lonely during those prayers, that God was closer to him in those moments than he had ever imagined. Now, whether you're religious or not, you've got to admit, that's kind of beautiful. This boy, stolen from his home, stripped of everything, found something in the silence that no one could take away. This is where the real story of St. Patrick begins. Not in the churches, not in the legends, but right here, on a lonely hillside, with a heartbroken teenager whispering prayers into the wind. But don't worry, we're not leaving him there. Because one night, after 6 long years, Maewyn had a dream. A strange dream, a powerful dream, a dream that would change everything. But we'll talk about that next time. For now, close your eyes. Let the sea grow still, let the hills grow quiet, let the sheep settle down, and let this thought drift through your mind as you fall asleep. Even in the darkest place, the spark of something greater can begin. The wind howled across the hills that night, not in an angry way, more like a whisper that had lost its way. The sheep were curled in tight little huddles, doing their best to ignore it, and Maewyn, the young slave boy who'd been taken from his home, sat wrapped in his threadbare cloak, staring up at the sky. He had been doing this for 6 years. 6 years of cold nights, hungry mornings, lonely thoughts, and whispered prayers. And yet, strangely, he wasn't bitter. Tired? Yes. Worn down? Definitely. But inside him, something had changed. The same silence that once felt terrifying had become familiar, even peaceful at times. He prayed constantly, not just because he had to, but because it felt like someone was listening, someone who cared. And then, one night, the dream came. Not a regular dream, not the kind where you show up to school with no shoes, or your teeth fall out, or you suddenly remember you forgot to feed your 3rd grade class goldfish. From 10 years ago. Number. This dream felt different. It was clear, vivid, like a voice reaching into his sleep and waking up something inside him. In the dream, Maewyn heard a voice say, "You have fasted well. Soon you will go home. Your ship is ready." Just like that. Simple, direct, and wild enough to shake him to his core. A ship? What ship? He was in the middle of Ireland. No ports, no sea in sight, no escape plan. Just sheep. Always the sheep. But still, the dream stuck with him. The next morning, he woke up with a strange kind of certainty burning in his chest. He knew what he had to do. Now, let's take a second to think about how bold this was. He had no map, no compass, no idea where the nearest coastline even was. But somehow, he walked, for days, maybe even 200 miles, some historians say, across wild country, forests, hills, rivers, sleeping under trees, avoiding people, starving, hoping he was going the right way. And the whole time that dream was ringing in his ears. Your ship is ready. Eventually, after what must have felt like walking across the entire planet in wet shoes, Maewyn reached the coast. And, believe it or not, there was a ship, a real ship, right there, just like the dream had said. But hold your applause. It wasn't that easy. The ship wasn't waiting just for him with a little welcome sign that said, "Hop on, future saint." Nope. It was a cargo ship, probably carrying Irish hounds or goods back to the continent. The captain took one look at Maewyn, ragged, dirty, no money, no connections, and said something like, "Yeah, no thanks." Ouch. After everything. Was this it? Was he going to be turned away? Sent back to the sheep? But Maewyn didn't give up. He walked away heart sinking and prayed, not just a polite prayer, a desperate one, and something changed. The captain called him back. Whether out of guilt, curiosity, or just realizing he needed someone to feed the dogs, we'll never know. But he offered Maewyn a place on board. Just like that, he was finally free. The ship set sail across the cold grey sea, back toward Britain, back toward the world Maewyn had once known, but no longer fit into. Now, here's where the story gets a little blurry. Different versions say different things. Some say the ship was lost for weeks after landing, that they wandered through wild, desolate places, that the men grew weak with hunger, that Maewyn prayed, and suddenly a herd of wild pigs appeared, saving everyone from starvation. Whether that part's true or not, we'll let you decide. But what matters is this: he made it home. After 6 long years, the boy returned. He saw his family again, the people who thought he was long gone. He was taller now, thinner, older, but something deeper had changed too. He wasn't just Maewyn anymore. He had faced the silence, the slavery, the fear, and somehow he had found something strong in the middle of it. He had found faith. Now you'd think this would be the happy ending, right? Reunited, safe, warm fires and soft blankets. Story over. Except it wasn't over, because just when he thought the adventure had ended, the dreams came back. This time, the voice said something else. Come back to us, Maewyn. Holy boy, walk among us again. It was the people of Ireland, in the dream, calling out to him. The very place that had once held him captive was now calling him back. Can you imagine? You escape a place that broke you, only to feel pulled back there. Not for revenge, but for love. That's not just unusual, that's rare, that's brave. That's kind of saint-like, actually. But Maewyn wasn't ready. Not yet. He knew he needed to learn more, grow more, understand his faith deeply, truly, fully. So he left home again, willingly this time, and travelled to Gaul, what we now call France, to study Christianity, to train as a priest, and eventually a bishop. But that's a story for the next chapter. For now, picture him standing on that windy coast, eyes closed, hair wild from the sea breeze, quietly whispering thanks. He had escaped. He had come home. But more than that, he had found purpose in the pain. So as you drift off tonight, here's a thought to keep close. Sometimes the most powerful paths begin with just one small step, even if that step is into the unknown, especially if it begins with a dream. Coming home after a long time away is always a bit weird. Even when it's just a holiday, you walk back into your room, everything's exactly where you left it, but somehow you're different. Like the furniture shrunk while you were gone, or your bed feels too soft, or the cereal box is still out of date, and yes, someone has definitely been in your stuff. Now imagine being gone for 6 years, as a slave, and then imagine coming back as a completely different person, to a world that hasn't changed much at all. That was Maewyn. He made it home, that much we know. Where exactly home was, we're not totally sure. Probably somewhere in Western Britain, maybe near the modern-day border of Wales and England. But home is less about geography and more about feeling, right? And Maewyn, well, he didn't quite feel at home anymore. Yes, his family was shocked and probably overjoyed to see him alive. Yes, there were tears, hugs, questions, more hugs. But imagine what was going on in his head. He was no longer the cheeky boy who liked to sneak off instead of helping his dad with taxes. He had survived slavery, walked across a foreign country, escaped by the skin of his teeth, and now he couldn't exactly go back to normal. He had changed. For a while he tried. He stayed with his family, helped out, reconnected with old routines, but something kept tugging at him. Like a pebble in his shoe, small but impossible to ignore. He was restless. And then came the dreams again. If you remember from before, Maewyn had a vision, a voice in his sleep calling him back to Ireland. Come walk among us again, holy boy. He called it the voice of the Irish. Over and over again the message came. Go back to the land of your slavery. Go back, not as a captive, but as a messenger. And here's where we stop for a second and ask the obvious question. Why would anyone go back to the place they were held as a slave? Especially willingly? The answer isn't simple, but maybe it was because of that same quiet strength he found on those lonely hills. Maybe he knew the people of Ireland weren't monsters. They were just people with beliefs, traditions, hearts, stories, and something inside him wanted to share what he had found, that deep peace, that sense of love, that connection to something bigger than pain. He didn't want revenge, he wanted transformation. But he also knew something else. He wasn't ready. He couldn't just walk back into Ireland, waving a cross and yelling, "Let's talk about Jesus." He needed knowledge, training, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of Latin grammar, because let's be honest, even saints need to know their verbs. So, Maewyn packed up once again. He said goodbye to his family again and set off on a new journey, this time to Gaul, the land we now call France. There, he would train to become a man of the church. Now, life in Gaul was different. It was the intellectual hub of Christian learning at the time. Think of it like the Oxford or Harvard of the early church world, only with more robes and fewer coffee shops. Maewyn probably studied under some big names, including possibly St. Germanus of Auxerre. Germanus was known for being wise, respected, and very serious about theology. And Maewyn? Well, he tried his best. But there's an important part of his story here that people often skip. He wasn't the smartest, he wasn't the best speaker, and he wasn't the most polished. In fact, many of the church leaders thought he was a little rough around the edges. His Latin was clumsy, his grammar wasn't great, and to top it off, he had no real formal education before being enslaved. Imagine being in a room full of scholars debating theology in flawless Latin, while you're still trying to remember which case is which. Poor guy. But here's what made him different. He didn't quit. He knew he had something to offer. Not because he was clever, but because he was called. That word, called, means a lot in stories like this. It's more than a feeling. It's that deep, quiet fire in your chest that whispers, this is what you're meant to do. So Maewyn kept studying. He prayed, he learned, he grew. And eventually, slowly, humbly, patiently, he was ordained. First as a deacon, then later as a priest, and eventually he was made a bishop. Not bad for a guy who used to herd sheep in the rain with nothing but a stick and a few confused prayers. Oh, and one more thing. Somewhere along the way, possibly as part of his training, he stopped going by Maewyn and took on a new name, a Roman name, a Christian name, Patricius, or as we know it today, Patrick. Think about that for a moment. The boy named Maewyn, awkward, quiet, dragged from his home and laughed at for his bad Latin, had become Bishop Patrick. And though he still felt nervous, unsure, and very much aware of his flaws, he was ready. Ready to return to Ireland, to bring a message of peace, to walk among the very people who once held him in chains, not as a victim, but as a light. But we'll get to that soon. For now, let this thought carry you into sleep. You don't need to be perfect to do something great. You don't need to speak the best, write the best, or look the part. Sometimes it's the quiet ones, the ones who've been through the dark, who carry the brightest light. And sometimes the very place that once broke you becomes the place where you begin again. By now, the name Maewyn had faded into the background. He was Patrick now, not just by name, but in spirit. The boy who once sat alone with sheep under the Irish rain had become a man walking among scholars and saints. Still quiet, still humble, but not the same. Life in Gaul, modern-day France, was a world apart from the windswept hills of Ireland or the familiar coast of Roman Britain. Here, there were great stone churches, monasteries filled with chanting monks, shelves stacked with scrolls and scriptures, meals shared in silence, long discussions about faith, sin, salvation, and, you guessed it, more Latin than any one man should have to handle. Patrick studied under men like St. Germanus of Auxerre, a well-known bishop and teacher. Germanus was respected, wise, and maybe just a little intimidating. But he saw something in Patrick, something beyond the clumsy speech or the rough past. He saw a heart on fire. Now, let's be honest. Patrick wasn't exactly the top of the class. He struggled with his studies, his writing was awkward, his Latin was poor, and while the other students debated fine points of theology, Patrick sometimes just sat quietly, listening, absorbing. But here's what made him different. He didn't speak from books. He spoke from experience. He didn't quote philosophers. He told stories about sheep, hunger, prayer, and survival. And slowly, very slowly, people began to listen. One of the most important parts of this time was learning how to live the faith, not just study it. That meant long hours of prayer, sometimes in cold stone chapels, sometimes in candlelight. It meant learning how to lead, how to comfort, how to serve. It meant understanding the Bible and also understanding people, their pain, their hopes, their doubts. In a way, Patrick had already been doing that for years, back on the hills of Ireland. Now he just had words for it. Eventually, after years of study and reflection, Patrick was ordained, first as a deacon, then a priest, and finally a bishop. That's a big deal, by the way. Becoming a bishop meant more than fancy robes and a shiny staff. It meant responsibility. It meant leadership. It meant being a spiritual father to entire communities. And still in his heart, Patrick never felt like he quite fit in. There's a moment, written in his own words, where Patrick talks about how people doubted him, not just once or twice, constantly. Some said he wasn't smart enough. Some whispered about his past, the fact that he had been a slave, that he wasn't from noble blood, that his Latin was laughable. Even Patrick himself admitted to feeling ashamed sometimes. He called himself unlearned and unpolished. And honestly, he probably was. But here's the thing. When you've spent 6 years alone on a hillside with nothing but sheep and storms, you stop worrying what other people think of your grammar. Instead of giving up or staying somewhere safe and comfortable, Patrick asked to do something crazy. He asked to go back to Ireland. That's right. Back to the land of his trauma. Back to the people who enslaved him. Back to a place where Christianity wasn't widely known or understood or accepted. The Roman Church had sent missionaries before. Some had tried, some had failed. But Patrick, he wasn't going in cold. He knew the land. He knew the language. He knew the people. Not from books, but from living among them. And even more importantly, he loved them. This is something we can't skip past. Patrick didn't go to Ireland with the goal of converting pagans like a military mission. He didn't see the Irish as lost or less than. He saw them as human beings, complex, deep, sacred, beloved. He knew their stories, their songs, their symbols, their spirit. He had lived their rhythms, shared their silence. And he felt called deeply, urgently, to bring them the same peace that had carried him through his darkest days. Not by force, not by fear, but with patience, kindness, and fire. His request to return to Ireland wasn't instantly approved. Some church leaders were hesitant. You want to do what now? Go back where? It was dangerous, risky, wild. But Patrick kept asking. And eventually the church agreed. He was officially commissioned. And so, years after escaping in chains, Patrick began preparing to walk back into the land of his captivity. As a free man with a sacred mission, he didn't go alone. He brought other believers with him, men who could help teach, build churches, and translate scripture. Together, they gathered supplies, scrolls, holy books, and, let's be honest, probably a lot of cloaks. Ireland isn't known for its dry weather. And then he sailed back to the place that had once stolen everything from him, back with love in his hands and peace in his voice. And that, dear listener, is where the next chapter of Patrick's story truly begins. Not as a scared boy, not as a student, but as a man who chose to return not with bitterness, but with grace. So as you settle into sleep tonight, here's a thought to carry with you. You don't have to be the smartest, the strongest, or the most impressive. You just have to be willing to grow, willing to forgive, willing to go where love sends you, even if it means returning to hard places. Because sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is go back, not to escape the past, but to heal it. The waves rolled steady under the wooden boat, and the wind carried that familiar smell of salt and seaweed. Patrick stood at the front, cloak fluttering, watching the coastline appear in the distance. Ireland, not a dream, not a memory, the real thing, and not just any shoreline. The same land where he'd once been dragged ashore in chains. But now he was sailing back. By choice? It must have been a strange mix of feelings. Fear, of course. Who wouldn't be afraid? He had no army, no protection, no guarantee of a warm welcome. Just faith, a few companions, and a heart full of quiet, stubborn courage. He stepped onto Irish soil again. The land of the Druids, the chieftains, the ancient gods, and the wild, untamed landscape that once knew his footsteps as a slave. He wasn't sure how people would react. After all, who wants a preacher showing up out of nowhere? But Patrick had one advantage no other missionary had before. He knew the people. He spoke the language. He understood the customs. He remembered the rhythms of their world, the stories, the seasons, the way they watched the stars. And more than that, they remembered him. Now some say he went straight to the man who had once enslaved him. Miliach. That's right. Patrick returned to face the very man who had owned him. Think about that for a second. That takes more than guts. That takes grace. He came not to shame him, not to seek revenge, but to offer something new, a message of peace, of faith, of transformation. But the story takes a twist. When Miliach heard Patrick was coming, he panicked. Terrified that Patrick would curse him or bring shame on his household, Miliach, according to legend, set fire to his own home and died in the flames. Why? Maybe guilt. Maybe fear of being exposed. Or maybe he just couldn't face the past standing in front of him. Whatever the reason, Patrick mourned him. He had come to offer forgiveness, and instead he found ashes. But Patrick didn't stop. He travelled, he preached, he walked from village to village, sometimes welcomed, sometimes threatened, sometimes ignored entirely. Some chieftains offered him shelter, others tried to kill him. No joke. He writes in his letters that he was robbed, beaten, imprisoned more than once. There were days he thought he might die in some ditch beside the road, but still, he kept going. Because for Patrick, this wasn't just a mission, this was redemption. He shared the story of Jesus, the one who healed, who forgave, who lifted up the broken. But he didn't just talk at the people. He listened, he learned, he found ways to connect their ancient Irish beliefs with the new faith he carried. For example, some say Patrick used the shamrock, that little three-leaf plant you find everywhere in Ireland, to explain the Christian idea of the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, 3 in 1. Was that historically accurate? Hard to say. But it worked, because it used their world to explain a deeper truth. Patrick never forced anyone to convert. That wasn't his way. He believed in patience, in kindness, in the power of example, not argument. And slowly, something began to shift. He wasn't just tolerated, he was trusted, respected, even loved. He baptized thousands, built churches, trained Irish followers who would become priests and leaders themselves. And maybe the most beautiful thing? He stayed. He didn't convert and run. He lived among the Irish. He walked their roads, sat by their fires, ate their bread, buried their dead, prayed with their sick. He became part of the story, not an outsider yelling from the edges, but a brother walking beside them. Now don't get the wrong idea. This wasn't a smooth ride to sainthood. Patrick still struggled. He still missed home. He still got tired. He still had critics, lots of them. In fact, at one point, some church officials tried to bring up an old sin from his youth, something he had confessed long ago. What was it? We're not sure. Patrick never said. But it hurt him deeply. He had left everything behind, comfort, family, reputation, and still, he wasn't enough for some people. That's how life is sometimes, isn't it? You pour your heart out, and someone somewhere says you're still not good enough. But Patrick didn't let it stop him. He kept going, he forgave, and he focused on the mission, not the noise. And here's something beautiful. The very land that once held him in chains now held him in love. So as you close your eyes tonight and the world quiets down around you, think about this. Patrick didn't need to be perfect. He didn't need to be clever or powerful. He just needed to be willing to return, to forgive, to serve. And through that simple, quiet faith, he changed the story of a nation. Ireland, in Patrick's time, wasn't just wild hills and friendly sheep. It was a land deeply spiritual, rich in rituals, ancient songs, and powerful symbols. And at the heart of that world were the Druids. They weren't just priests. They were the keepers of knowledge, the storytellers, the healers, the judges, and in some places, the power behind the throne. Imagine wise, white-robed men standing under ancient oaks, speaking in riddles, reading the stars, and guiding kings through dream interpretations and sacred fires. This was not a world that welcomed outsiders lightly. So when Patrick showed up, this strange foreign bishop with a shaved head and a wooden staff, the Druids took notice. And not the good kind. They saw him as a threat, not just to their beliefs, but to their authority. He was introducing new ideas, a faith not built around cycles of nature or sacred wells, but around one eternal God who had no season, no stone idol, no carved figure. He preached of grace instead of sacrifice, of peace instead of fear. And worst of all, people were listening. Now, the most famous clash between Patrick and the Druids happened at a place called Tara, the seat of the High King of Ireland. Think of Tara like the ancient capital, a sacred hill where kings ruled and laws were spoken aloud for all to hear. It was also a major centre of pagan ritual, and one of the most important days of the year, Beltane, the spring fire festival, a time when no fires were to be lit before the High King's ceremonial flame burned atop the hill. It was about control, order, and tradition. So what did Patrick do? He lit a fire, but not just any fire. He climbed nearby Slane Hill within sight of the royal court and lit the Easter fire, a bright blazing flame to celebrate the resurrection of Christ, right in view of Tara, right in defiance of the pagan custom. You can imagine the reaction. The king's court exploded in confusion and the Druids were furious. They warned the king, "If this fire is not put out tonight, it will never be extinguished in Ireland." That sounds dramatic, doesn't it? But they were right, because Patrick's fire wasn't extinguished. In fact, it spread. The king sent for Patrick. He marched into Tara, bold, unshaken, with his clergy behind him, chanting prayers in Latin. According to legend, the Druids tried everything to stop him. Magic, spells, illusions. One version even says a Druid summoned a dark mist to blind Patrick and his men. Patrick answered with a simple prayer, and the mist vanished. Another Druid tried to curse him with words. Patrick made the sign of the cross, and the man fell silent. Again, these are legends. How much is fact? How much is myth? Hard to say. But what's clear is this: Patrick stood firm. He didn't run, he didn't argue, he simply declared his faith clearly, boldly, and with grace. And then came one of the most powerful moments. Patrick stood before the king, the Druids, the nobles, and all the watchers at Tara, and recited what is now called St. Patrick's breastplate, a prayer of protection, a declaration of devotion, a kind of spiritual armour. Here's just a tiny part of it. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me. Isn't that beautiful? Not angry, not aggressive, just full of love and light. Now, did the king convert that day? Not quite. But, and this is key, he let Patrick go. And even more surprising, he let him continue preaching. He had seen the strength of Patrick's conviction. He had watched the Druids falter, and perhaps deep down he knew that Ireland was changing, one quiet flame at a time. The battle at Tara wasn't just about one festival or one king or one fire. It was symbolic. It showed the turning tide, from fear to faith, from old ways to new paths. But Patrick didn't celebrate with ego. He didn't shout, "I won!" He just kept going, town by town, fire by fire, heart by heart. And here's something amazing. Patrick never once attacked the old faiths. He didn't destroy temples. He didn't mock the Druids. Instead, he respected the Irish people. He walked with them. He used symbols they already knew, like water, light, stone, and circle, and showed how they could point to something deeper. He planted seeds of faith in familiar soil, and because of that, those seeds grew. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine this: a dark hillside, a forbidden fire, and one man standing firm in the face of ancient power, not with swords or shouting, but with a gentle flame and a heart full of courage. When you think about changing a whole country, it sounds like a huge job, right? Mountains to move, armies to lead, crowds to gather. But Patrick's story, it was quieter, slower, more like planting seeds in a garden one by one. Remember when Patrick first returned to Ireland? He didn't arrive with trumpets or banners. He arrived with a simple message, one that spoke to people's hearts. One person at a time. He started with the small things, visiting villages, listening to stories, helping the sick, baptizing those ready. And maybe, most importantly, he made friends. Think about it. Patrick knew this was more than just religion. It was about community, about belonging, about hope, and he saw that in every face he met. Some of his closest friends were Irish chieftains, powerful men who ruled their lands but were open enough to listen. Patrick didn't demand they give up everything overnight. He invited them to think differently, to see the world through new eyes, and many said yes. One famous story is about a man named Tadhg, who was so impressed by Patrick's kindness, he became one of his strongest supporters. These friendships made Patrick's mission possible, because in a world where words could spark wars, trust was everything. Patrick also worked with ordinary people, farmers, fishermen, weavers, who were curious about this new faith. He would gather around fires at night and share stories from the Bible. Stories of love, courage, forgiveness. Stories that felt like home, even though they came from a faraway land. And while he didn't always have the biggest crowds, he had something better. Faithful followers who believed in what he was doing. They helped spread the message. They built churches from wood and stone. They taught others to pray. They became the backbone of the new Irish church. Now, it's easy to think of Patrick as just a man who preached, but he was also a teacher, a builder, a leader, a shepherd. He taught people how to read the scriptures, how to pray, how to live with kindness and courage. He helped create the first monasteries, places where people could come to learn to pray and to find peace. These monasteries became the heart of Ireland's spiritual life for centuries. And here's a little secret: Patrick wasn't perfect. He made mistakes, he got frustrated, he faced doubt from others and sometimes from himself. But he kept going because he knew the change he wanted to see wasn't quick. It was a journey. And that's the magic of Patrick's story. Not some big flashy moment, but 1,000 small ones. Each person touched, each heart opened, each life changed. So tonight, as you lay your head down, remember this. Real change doesn't happen all at once. It's slow, it's patient, it's kind. Just like Patrick, one soul at a time. When you hear the name St. Patrick, what pops into your head? Maybe it's a green hat, maybe a parade, maybe a certain little green plant, the shamrock, or even the story about chasing snakes out of Ireland. But here's the thing. How much of what we think we know is actually true? Let's start with the famous one. The snakes. Everyone says St. Patrick drove all the snakes out of Ireland. But here's the twist. Ireland probably never had snakes in the first place. The island's climate and geography didn't really support them. So what's going on? Some scholars think the snakes were actually symbols representing pagan beliefs or evil spirits. In this sense, Patrick wasn't literally chasing reptiles, but banishing old ways of thinking. He was clearing the spiritual air, making space for new ideas. Now, what about the shamrock? Legend says Patrick used the shamrock to explain the Christian idea of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, all part of one God. It's a beautiful story, and it fits nicely with Irish culture. But did it really happen? We don't have written proof from Patrick himself. The shamrock became popular in stories much later. Still, it's a lovely symbol, and one that ties together faith and nature. Then there's the idea that Patrick wrote a special prayer called the breastplate. This prayer is powerful, poetic, and packed with imagery. Whether or not Patrick himself wrote it, it captures the spirit of his mission. Protection, faith, and courage in the face of challenges. And what about his writings? Unlike many saints, Patrick actually left behind letters. 2 short letters. They're humble, simple, and full of emotion. In them, Patrick talks about his struggles, his faith, and his mission. Reading these letters, we get a glimpse of the real man. Not a perfect hero, but a deeply human figure. Someone who was tired, sometimes scared, and yet determined. So why do the legends grow? Why do we love stories about fire, snakes, and shamrocks? Because stories help us remember. They make the past come alive, they teach us lessons, and sometimes they help us believe in something bigger than ourselves. But it's also important to know the difference, to hold both the myths and the reality in our hands, because the truth, Patrick's real story, is just as inspiring. A man who overcame fear and hardship, who returned to a land that once held him captive, who shared a message of love and forgiveness. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember, legends sparkle like stars in the sky. But the real journey, the quiet, brave journey, is just as bright. When you think about St. Patrick today, you probably picture green fields, shamrocks, and maybe a parade full of smiling faces. But his real legacy? It runs much deeper. Patrick didn't just bring a new religion to Ireland, he helped lay the foundation for a whole new culture, one where faith and learning could grow side by side, where communities came together to build churches, schools, and monasteries. After Patrick's time, Ireland became known as the Island of Saints and Scholars. Monasteries popped up all over the country. These weren't just places to pray, they were centres of learning, art, and culture. Irish monks copied ancient manuscripts by hand, preserving knowledge that might have been lost forever. They created beautiful illuminated text filled with colour and intricate designs. This love of learning and faith spread beyond Ireland's shores. Irish missionaries travelled to Europe, sharing their knowledge, art and stories. Ireland became a beacon of light during a dark time in history. And all of this started with a simple man who sailed back to a land that once held him prisoner. Patrick's legacy isn't just about religion, it's about courage, about forgiveness, about the power of one person to change the course of history. And maybe that's why people still tell his story today, not just for the legends or the symbols, but because his life reminds us, no matter where you come from, no matter what you've been through, you can make a difference. So as you close your eyes tonight, think about this. What legacy do you want to leave behind? Close your eyes and imagine this. Bright green everywhere, parades rolling down city streets, music swirling through the air, people wearing shamrocks and silly hats. It's March 17th, St. Patrick's Day. But how did this quiet gentleman become the star of such a big festive day? Well, it didn't happen overnight. St. Patrick died sometime in the 5th century. For hundreds of years, his story was told quietly in churches and villages. Then, over time, people started to celebrate his feast day. March 17th was set as the day to remember him. At first, it was a solemn day of prayer and reflection, but as Irish people moved around the world, especially to places like the United States, they brought their stories and traditions with them, and in new lands, the celebrations grew bigger and louder. In cities like Boston, Chicago, and New York, Irish immigrants held parades, wearing green, playing music, and celebrating their heritage. Green rivers, green beer, and giant floats became part of the fun. Now it's a day for everyone, Irish or not, to celebrate Irish culture, kindness, and a little bit of magic. And here's a fun fact. In Ireland, St. Patrick's Day was once a religious holiday where pubs were closed. Now, it's one of the biggest party days of the year. But behind all the fun, it's good to remember the real reason for the day. A man who brought hope to a land, who showed forgiveness, and who changed the world quietly, one person at a time. So tonight, as you dream, maybe you'll see a parade of green, or hear the soft sound of a fiddle, and maybe you'll feel a little closer to the man behind the stories. Symbols are like secret codes, little pictures or signs that hold big meaning. And when it comes to St. Patrick, there are plenty of symbols that dance around his story. First up, the shamrock. This tiny green three-leafed plant isn't just a lucky charm. It's said that Patrick used the shamrock to explain the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. A simple plant teaching a big idea. But here's a fun twist. The shamrock wasn't always green. In old times, some shamrocks had 4 leaves. And that extra leaf, it's supposed to bring extra luck. So if you ever spot one, hold on to it tight. Next, the snake. We talked before about how Patrick drove snakes out of Ireland. But since Ireland probably didn't have snakes to begin with, what's the story there? Snakes were often symbols for evil or pagan beliefs. So, in a way, Patrick's snakes were old ideas being replaced with new faith. Then there's the Claddagh ring, a circle of love, friendship and loyalty. Though not directly linked to Patrick, it's become part of Irish tradition, often worn as a symbol of connection. And let's not forget the colour green. Ireland is known as the Emerald Isle, so green makes sense. Plus, green represents spring, new life and growth, fitting for a story about hope and renewal. Lastly, the cross. Patrick is often shown holding a cross made of wood or shamrocks. It's a reminder of his faith and mission. Symbols help us remember stories. They make history feel alive. And when you see a shamrock or wear a bit of green on March 17th, you're joining a tradition that's been growing for centuries. So, as you settle down tonight, maybe imagine yourself in a field of shamrocks, feeling the soft green beneath your feet. A small plant with a big story, just like St. Patrick. When we think of St. Patrick, often we picture legends and stories passed down through centuries. But what about the man himself? Luckily, Patrick left behind something rare for a saint of his time. Letters. 2 short letters, to be exact. And these little notes open a window into his heart. The first letter is called the Confessio. It's kind of like a spiritual diary. In it, Patrick talks about his life, his mission, and his deep faith. He tells us about being captured as a young man, about how he found God while in captivity, and how he felt called to return to the very place that had held him prisoner. His words are honest and humble. He admits his failings, he asks for forgiveness, and he praises God's mercy. The second letter is known as the Epistola. It's a letter of appeal to some Christian leaders asking for help in his mission to spread the faith in Ireland. Reading these letters, we hear a man who's deeply committed but also very human. He's tired from hard work. He's worried about the people he's trying to help. He feels the weight of responsibility, but he never loses hope. His faith shines through every word. So when you hear stories about St. Patrick's miracles and battles, remember this. At the heart of it all was a man with a simple, powerful belief, a belief in grace, in forgiveness, in love. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine holding one of those letters. Feel the strength and courage in those quiet words, and know that behind every legend there's a real story waiting to be told. As the night grows quiet and the stars twinkle softly above, it's time to reflect on the story we've shared. The story of St. Patrick, a story that crosses centuries, cultures, and even myths. But at its heart, it's a story about something timeless: courage, faith, hope, and the power of one person to make a difference. Patrick wasn't perfect. He was scared, he made mistakes, but he kept going, because he believed that change starts with a single step, a single spark, a single voice. His story reminds us that even in the darkest times, light can shine through, that even when we feel small or unsure, our actions matter. Maybe you're not crossing seas or facing ancient druids, but you have your own challenges, your own moments to be brave. And just like Patrick, you can choose kindness. You can choose hope. You can choose to make the world a little better. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, carry this thought with you. The story of St. Patrick is not just about the past. It's a gentle reminder that each of us holds the power to bring light, to bring peace, to bring love. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with courage, kindness, and a little bit of magic.